Does your sheet say live?
It's live. Start talking.
Live.
Okay. Welcome to the Plot Thickens, where empowerment goes to the movie. On goes to the movies. On today's show, we're going to be reviewing Selma, where Martin Luther King Jr.'s dream met the road. First, let me introduce my co-hosts. We have Len in New York and Mike here in Orlando. How you doing, guys?
Hello, how you doing,
Doing
Coop?
fine.
Hi.
Today's show is very significant. It is our first show in the series on movies that empower people. And appropriately, I think, it is on Selma. Now, first, let me give you some basic facts about this movie. Of course, it was released in 2014 in general distribution this year. The production companies were Plan B, Harpo Films, Cloud 8, Salador Films, and Path. And perhaps more importantly, the executive producers were Brad Pitt, Nick Bauer, Avon DuVernay, Paul Garnes, and Dermoon McNow. The actors are really all new. David Oyelowo, Tom Wilkinson, Tim Roth. And what we'll be doing today is covering not only the movie, but the implications of the movie. Let's begin with the backstory. Lenny, why don't you take that?
Okay. Well, first of all, this is a story about. It's actually set during the height of the American civil rights movement, and it depicts the marches from Selma, Alabama, to the state capitol at Montgomery to secure voting rights for black people. The marches were led by Martin Luther King Jr., and actually the whole scene was set by the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. Now, when we talk about backstory, what we're talking about is context. You know, the context in which the movie itself came about. Things perhaps that are not always clear in the movie or clear to people who are not aware of all the details of that struggle. One of the first things it does is it puts into context the current assault by many people on the right wing who are demanding unfair, higher standards for voting in a way that disproportionately disenfranchises many African Americans. You'll understand that better when you see this movie. It also reminds many people of what happened in Selma in yesteryear, where people like Martin Luther King, fighting for civil and human rights, was accused of playing the race card. And I think many of us have heard that today when we react to situations that come about, brutality, racism. Many say we're playing the race card. The third thing is, in the context, is that unbeknownst at the time by many, Martin Luther King was under surveillance by the FBI for a long period of time. And that continued until his death, and may even have contributed to his death. The fourth thing I want to mention is that I think the picture puts in context that Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, these organizations were coming closer to each other. And they were coming closer to going beyond civil rights and moving into the area of human rights and economic rights, which ultimately got both Martin Luther King and Malcolm X assassinated. Finally, I would say that what you get from this movie is a more real picture of Martin Luther King Jr. as not just this great man, but he's a human being who went through his trials, tribulations. He's a real person, and when you see this film, I think you'll become much more aware of the psychosocial pathology that underlies the whole resistance to rights for African Americans.
Okay, let me talk about the characters and the performances. Of course, the definitive role is Martin Luther King. Very difficult role to play because in our minds we have all seen him, we've all heard him. Especially the march on from the March on Washington. Can you see me?
Yes.
Okay. The David Oyelowo is a spot on as Dr. King. He captures the look, the posture, and the spirit of the man. More importantly, he captures the person as a man, a iconic man, but not as a saint. The second important role is Carmen Ejogo, who plays Coretta Scott King. And she also, she's not a person that we know in terms of having a screen presence, but I bought the character that she pulled off and the strength and the intelligence of her support, even though she was in the background during the movement. And in this movie, it shows she wasn't as much in the background as many people believe. And I think that's important because those of us that were in the civil rights movement know that women played a critical role in the movement, even though during those times the men were out front. For example, I think on the March on Washington, I don't think there was a single female speaker on the podium, which is something that wouldn't happen today. John Lewis is also a critical role. That's played by Stephen James, and he pulls that off. He's playing every black young person. And through him, you get to understand how even though they were living in a dangerous time and engaged in a severely dangerous activity, I mean, their lives were at risk, how they had the strength and belief, not only in the movement, but in the nonviolence of the movement, not just as a strategy, but as a philosophy. Now, there were a lot of roles, the heads of SNCC, Andy Young, Hosea Williams, that you saw in the background. They didn't make that much of an impact. And I think the reason for that is an epic story. So they couldn't give details of everybody's participation. But Malcolm X, Nigel Thatch, hit that role out of the park. Only on the screen for a few moments, but he makes the case of Martin Luther King, of a Malcolm, in the latter part of his life that appreciated Martin Luther King's role in the movement and his role in the movement, even though he had accused Martin Luther King of being a puppet of the white establishment. But it's a very educational encounter with Martin Luther King's wife. Another important role. The original movie, when it was first put together, was supposed to be just two main roles with other supportive characters. One was Martin Luther King and the president. The director expanded the movie beyond that role. And Johnson hits it out of the park. As a charming yet clever master politician. Now, also I think a great role is played by George Wallace. Now, George Wallace here is played as a shrewd politician. Now, this role is tricky because it could have been played as a clown or as it could have been played as some evil, manipulative villain. But she also is able, the director is able to show that he was a human being.
I think his son would disagree with you.
Pardon me?
I think his son would disagree with you, George.
Yes, and in fact, his son has disagreed. I'm going to come back to that later, but his son is one of the controversies of the film. His son has said that the movie mischaracterized his father as a violent segregationist. There's no question he's a segregationist, and there's no question he ordered the troops that was the state troopers that were standing at the Pettus Bridge. But we'll come back to that. Um, Hoover is an interesting characterization because Hoover, we now know, as Len pointed out, was engaged not only in the surveillance of Martin Luther King, but in the destruction of Martin Luther King and his family and other black leaders as part of his, and he explained it as a part of national defense against communism. Again, that's not brought out in the movie, and we'll talk about later how the movie underplays certain things. But you understand how manipulative Hoover is and the interplay between him and Johnson. Oprah has to be mentioned. She has a really small but significant role in the movie. She represents the foot soldiers of the movement and explains very easily how I thought after 1964 Civil Rights Act that blacks could vote everywhere. She shows how manipulative the states use the election laws to prevent blacks from voting. And of course, there's Sheriff Clark, and he is of course the man who stood at the bridge, who ordered the Bloody Sunday attack seen around the world. So the character, there's the only star that you've heard me mention is Oprah. And that may have worked because you weren't thinking about the stars, you were thinking about the performances. And Oprah, even in Oprah's performance, you weren't thinking about Oprah. She dressed down. She was every woman. Now let's talk about our best scenes. Mike, what were your best scenes from this movie?
Honestly, at first I was going to say the scene right after Bloody Sunday when they were all sitting in the cots and everybody was giving first aid to one another. And the young man, he actually wanted to get a gun and wanted to kill the cop. And one of the leaders with Martin Luther King said, "You kill 2, they'll kill 10." I thought that was a great scene. It really was. But looking back at it, thinking back at it, I want to say that the scene with Coretta Scott and Amelia Bonnet, right? Boynette? Did I say her name, last name right?
Right.
Yeah, I want to say that scene right before Coretta Scott saw Malcolm X. I think that's the most powerful scene when Amelia was basically saying, you are prepared. You have people that have paved the way for generations, literally, so you can be prepared. You come from a great ancestry. So I have to say that I can't find her quotes exactly, but I have to say that that scene to me spoke the most. It said the most. It was encouraging unlike anything else.
Okay, Lenny, what were your best scenes in the movie?
Yeah, I would say that the first one I would mention would be the opening scene, the bombing of the church. What I liked about that scene was the fact that you knew what happened, but they didn't show the blood and guts. But that set the tone for the whole movie because it right away said that there's a lot of pain and a lot of suffering that we endured in that time. The second thing I would mention would be there was a scene where I think it was in the second march, because there were 3 marches to Selma. They were crossing the bridge. They got about maybe 2/3 of the way. Martin Luther King stopped. He almost looked as if he went into a trance. He kneeled down, and when he got up, he turned around and made his way through the crowd. In essence, he was saying, we're going to cancel or postpone this march. But it wasn't done through dialogue. It was done through viewing him, turning around, and moving through the crowd. We can get into later the symbolism of that, but I thought that basically what it said to me was that it showed the courage and humility of Martin Luther King Jr. because you knew that he was going to be heavily criticized by all the people around the country who spent their time, energy, and money to get there, by all the people who worked and organized for that moment. People were going to say he punked out, so forth and so on. But he had a reason to do it because he didn't want to lead his people to slaughter. It didn't mean that he didn't intend to return, but he seemed to have gotten a message from on high that he needed to turn around at that point. And then the third and final one I would mention would be the toward the end of the movie, there was a white woman who had come from Detroit. We didn't know this from the movie, the fact that she had 5 children back there in Detroit. And she came to Selma to participate, and she was murdered. And that, to me, shows you a number of things. Number one, it shows that the psychosocial pathology of people who engaged in that kind of violence goes beyond race. It's much more of a problem in depth. And it also brought home the fact that all of us are vulnerable, no matter what race. When one group of people is oppressed, it threatens all of us. Those are the scenes that I would say have the most impact on me.
And let me just comment on the scene that you mentioned about him kneeling down. What made that so profound was that the state troopers had ordered the opening. I mean, they had moved out of the way. So they were saying, okay, come on. So on the surface, it looked like a victory. All he had to do now was walk through the troops. Now, one of the relatives of Sheriff Clark said that the reason that they stopped the blacks the first time, the African Americans the first time on the bridge, was they had reports that the Ku Klux Klan was in the woods with snipers, and they would have killed them. Not a very effective defense, and you practically killed them yourself. John Lewis, it's a miracle that he's alive after the beating that he took. But when the state troopers opened up and he kneeled down and then he got up, I didn't remember the story that well. I was shocked when he turned around and walked through the crowd, and the crowd followed him. Let me turn to my best scenes. And my best scenes has to do right before that scene took place. After the first march, and all the people were beaten, Martin Luther King came with the brilliant strategy of calling on America's moral leaders, in this case religious leaders, to join him. Black, white, nuns, rabbis, whoever, for that second march. And on the steps of the church, you saw them arriving, knowing that they were walking into the jaws of death. I mean, this was no joke. And they came willingly because they understood the importance and the feeling of solidarity just came to me across on the screen. The second moment, best scene in the movie, was the confrontation between President Johnson and George Wallace. Sitting in the White House, they're obviously having an old boys discussion, even using the N-word among each other. But they're trying to outmaneuver each other. Johnson is trying to get Wallace to see that he needs to be on the right side of history. And Wallace is taking the position that was popular at the time. And it's not in the movie, and I think the director assumes that you know this, but Wallace, in his inauguration speech on the steps of Montgomery, said, segregation now, segregation tomorrow, and segregation forever. He was the postal boy for segregation in America, and he wasn't giving up his position. But the tension as they tried to outmaneuver each other to advance their position, I thought was extraordinary and honest. Like I said, it didn't make Wallace look like a clown. It made him look like a slick politician, which he was. The third scene, and if you are African American, you know when you go to the movies, especially if there's a large black audience, which there was where I went, people talk back to the movie. It's called shout and response. I think it comes out of the church tradition.
Call and response, yeah.
Call and response, right? It comes out of the church tradition. And throughout the movie, that was happening. But there was one moment that the theater dropped dead silent. And that was when the movie went to the point of Martin Luther King's infidelity. And the way Coretta Scott King discovered it was the FBI, we now know, put together tapes of Martin Luther King and his lover or lovers and sent it to her in her mailbox at home. And in that box with the tapes, they also sent him a letter suggesting that he commit suicide. And I think it was 43 days. It had a specific date time, which was the date he would have received the Nobel Peace Prize. But the grace with which Coretta Scott King, I'm going to use the performers, handled that, I mean, the truth of that moment, the authenticity of that moment was very well done. I was wondering, well, how do you go there? How do you not go there, being that's a part of the story? But how do you go there in a way that you don't destroy the legacy of the man?
I'd like to ask you a question, Coolidge, on that. Much of what you just said is backstory, context that's not depicted in the movie. Do you think, did you know that when you saw the movie, or did you discover some of those facts after you left the movie?
I knew before the movie that he had sent the package. In fact, I knew when both of us went to NYU, both of us later organized freedom rides to Alabama, as most of the people probably viewing know. But one of our instructors, I think his name was Townsend, was a reporter for the New York Times. And he actually listened to that tape. He said they got it in a plain envelope, and they listened to the tape, and the tape purported that it was Martin Luther King and his lovers. Now, the New York Times did not publish that story. So I knew it, but I knew it indirectly. The fact that the tape was delivered to his home, I knew that had come out publicly. And even the part that they had a letter with it. Now, what was not in the movie was the fact that there was a letter in the package encouraging Martin Luther King to kill himself.
Well, Coolidge, this underscores the fact that when we go to see these kinds of historical movies, it actually behooves us to do a little bit of research ahead of time to get context so that we can understand some of the deeper meaning of the movie, because you can't get everything into the movie.
True. And just moving on to, let's say, worst scenes in the movie or mistakes, I didn't see a bad scene in the movie. Every scene had a significance. My concern was, my initial concern was that it was too restrained. It was symbolically violent, and I don't know if people felt how really savage and brutal that day was. For example, what the director does is she takes a baseball bat, she shows the crowd, the white crowd, taking a baseball bat and winding barbed wire around it. But of course, you never see barbed wire being them hitting black children and women with this barbed wire. They take John Lewis, who was beaten with an inch of his death, and yes, he's hit, but he's just knocked down. It's not really bloody, and the shock of the people watching on television was they probably saw blood for the first time on American television. Um, Mike, did you see any problems with the movie?
Actually, I wanted to talk about what you were just saying.
Go
I
ahead.
I agree. This movie was, I would say, lacking the roots or the 12 years a slave effect, basically, without all the graphics and high definition of the blood being spilled and showing all the faces of these people while they're being beaten the way they were. But I believe that in a sense that was also a good thing. Because, like, I've heard some people say you don't want to be too black to scare somebody away, but you don't want to be too vanilla to not get your point across. You see what I mean? And I think that's what the director did an outstanding job in. She actually showed you, yes, the bat with the wire, but she did not show the blood. She let your own imagination do the work. So you knew what was going on. Yes, she got her point across without actually showing you the picture, something you've already seen and heard before. So I agree to an extent. Yes, it could have shown more of what actually happened in a more gruesome detail, but it wasn't to the point where it took away from that moment. You still felt every punch, every hit, every beat. You still felt their pain while you were seeing the movie.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that she actually did a great job of bridging that gap from being rated R and not being too PG, just smack dab in the middle. I think she did an outstanding job of doing that.
Just before you get, I think you have another point, but before you get it, just to piggyback on what you just said, you know, it's something that's missing in a lot of movies today, aesthetics, meaning that you know, you have movies where there's explosions and bombs and shootings and killings and blood and guts, or you have sex, graphic sex, uh, that we don't really need to see. It doesn't add to the picture. So it's, or we have comedians who the only thing they can do is cuss, instead of those comedians who are so good that just a twinkle of their eye or a movement of their body, you're in stitches. So I think the movie was very aesthetic in that sense and artistic. I believe you also had some ideas about Malcolm, did you, Mike?
Yeah, I when I look back at it, I actually it's hard to look at this Malcolm and not think of Denzel, Malcolm X. You know, I don't think anybody can ever play Malcolm X the way Denzel ever played Malcolm X. Yes, this actor did do an outstanding job, but looking at him, I still don't think anybody can really outdo Denzel as Malcolm X. I do wish, however, though, that some of his speech could have been shown in the movie. I understand that they had a very limited amount of time to show this massive event that took place over weeks, months. So I think it was about 3 months total. So I do understand why they had to cut certain things, but I do wish at the same time that right after Coretta Scott had actually spoken to Malcolm X, that it would show some of his speech, so people could get an understanding of why and how, I would say, Martin Luther King and Malcolm X actually did start to have a similar idea on the movement and how the movement should go. Because not only was it a transformation of what happened in Selma, but Malcolm X went through a transformation. At that time, he was no longer a part of the nation at that particular time. He was actually going on his own path. So it showed his personal transformation as well. And I think that they could have done just a little bit more on showing his own personal transformation as well.
Well, you know, that's a great point. I think that how she gets around that is the fact that she sowed a seed. For those people who don't know about Malcolm X, I would dare say I would want to go find out, well, who was this man Malcolm X? I hear about him here, I hear about him there. So a good movie, when it can't cover everything, at least it can lead you, inspire you to look more deeply into it.
And
Well, also, there is a movie, Malcolm X, which
but,
Still can
but
be
yeah, but one more thing that just actually made me think about something. Are you guys still there? Or just the screen just went green. You still there?
Yeah.
we're still here. Can
Yeah,
everybody see each other?
Yeah.
I can't see you. But I remember when he was talking to Coretta Scott and she was still skeptical about whether or not she should allow him to speak to the people. He was basically saying, let the leadership see me. And once they see me, they'll rather deal with Martin than deal with me. You know, so that's saying something right there in itself, that Malcolm X, he has a bad reputation outside of the black community as being the violent type, always wanting to, to hurt somebody, always willing to fight. But that also showed right then that he was willing to take the beatings as well. He was willing to be the bad guy so that Martin Luther King can be the good guy and further the movement. And I think that's something that she did an outstanding job of showing, that Malcolm X wasn't so gun-ho as people made him out to be.
Well,
he was actually for the people.
The ironic thing about that is that Malcolm X, you never heard Malcolm X actually suggest violence, but he talked about self-defense.
Yes.
Right.
But see, again, this relates to the whole point of leaders in the movie. There are those who are very upset with not enough of a role of Malcolm X, not enough of a role of James Foreman, who was the head of SNCC, and others in SNCC, because they did so much work in preparing for that march and laying the groundwork for Martin Luther King to be there. And my own feeling is that the scenes with the SNCC leaders, I wasn't completely happy with them, because they seemed to me to be portrayed a bit like being petulant, young, envious people, which may have been part of what was happening, but they legitimately did do years and years and years of work and blood and sweat and tears to set the stage for Martin Luther King to come in and do the march. So I thought that there might have been some creative ways to give a little bit more insight about that, and not depict the SNCC leaders simply as young and petulant people.
Did you have any other problems with the movie, or worse scenes or errors, Lenny?
No, that was pretty much it.
Okay, let's talk about the message of the movie. Lenny, why don't you just continue? What do you think the message of this movie is?
Well, I think the message of the movie is that black people and oppressed people, whoever they are, have a voice and should speak. The message was that it is up to black people to give themselves a voice. It's also about the perseverance of black people and people who were oppressed, in spite of enduring tremendous pain and suffering and denial of their basic human, civil, and constitutional rights. But I think underlying all of that is a much even deeper message that I got. And that message is that racism is a sign of a deep-seated pathological, psychosocial pathological strain in America today and in certain people in America. And that this psychosocial pathology leads to terrorism and all the kinds of things that you saw in the movie. So I feel that the way in which the movie treated it helps bring to light, helps to make us more conscious of that underlying psychosocial pathology. And it helps maybe young people who weren't around then to understand why there's such a venomous and pathological venom spewed out at Obama for the things that he's trying to do. It has its roots in that same pathology that played out there in Selma. The other thing I would say is that the message is that for all Americans, when you look at the media and listen to the ideologues speaking, understand that very often they are simply projecting. Like, for instance, when it's Martin Luther King is portrayed as playing the race card. We know today Al Sharpton and others are portrayed as playing the race card when they respond and react to acts of violence against black people. This is a projection by those who oppress, because they are the ones who are in fact playing the race card. But I think finally the message I got, and I don't know if it came across, but the message I got is that we have to be very careful that we don't fall prey to that same pathology, that we don't act like sheep in a herd and believe everything we hear on the media. We need to research, we need to look at the context of things, and we need to help to bring to the light, to conscientize the truth of what's really going on. Those are some messages that I got.
As a young person, Mike, not being there at the time and just, I guess, hearing about it in school and from this movie, what do you think the message of this movie is?
Some things really don't change, to be honest with you. That's one of the things I got from that, looking at this and looking at Ferguson in New York, and how I think his name was Jamie Lee Jackson was
Right.
treated,
Mm-hmm.
and looking at Eric Garner, a wannabe cop, and George Zimmerman. It makes me think some things don't change, so the fight continues. That's why people are still doing what they're doing. That's why activists are still out there. I think an activist's ultimate goal is to retire, to have no fight to fight, in my opinion. That should be their ultimate goal, and I realize right now we still have a long way to go. There's a quote from Bob Marley saying, "The people who are trying to make this world worse aren't taking a day off. How can I?" That right there also says another thing too, where the fight continues. You have to keep going. And I thought about how, although Coretta Scott her husband was having an affair, she stayed with, I believe, this is just my personal opinion, one of the reasons why she stayed with Dr. King, knowing that the FBI was trying to break them up, tear up the family, was also because that was her in her opinion, role in the movement. She had to stay supportive to Dr. King to keep that movement, to keep that whole circle alive. Same thing with Malcolm X. The reason why he was saying he let him be the bad guy, so they would rather deal with Martin Luther King than deal with Malcolm X, deal with him. I realize sometimes you have to just continue to fight. That's what I got from the movie. Even when it's not easy, continue to fight. Go ahead.
Yeah, just to piggyback on that that one point, people should realize that some of you young people, especially who haven't researched it, like yourself, Mike, Martin Luther King was attacked by even the Negro leaders as being too radical.
Yes.
When he was talking about a march on Washington and the Poor People's March, he was treated as if he was some kind of wild-eyed radical. This shows you how deep the pathology has gone in our own community, and it's just ironic that you had this going on. So in a sense, then I think that helped Malcolm X and Martin Luther King to see that they're in the same boat. They need to talk to each other and work together.
But there was one scene. It was real quick, and I want to say it was between LBJ and I think it's Wallace, Governor Wallace, when they were saying Malcolm X and Martin Luther King together. That's a bad mix. That's not something they were willing to deal with. And I think right now that's a problem that we're still dealing with today. Unity produces results. And apparently everybody knows that but us. When Martin Luther King and Malcolm X came together, just for that brief moment, look what happened. Just for that brief moment. Imagine if they started out that way. Imagine if everybody who supported Dr. King and everybody who supported Malcolm X came together. How much more could have been accomplished? And I think that's another message that both young and old can relate to today. That if we did stand together, if we continue to stand together, how much more could we accomplish? The mob will always win no matter what. The mob will always win. Majority rules, I'm sorry, as long as the majority sticks together.
Now, my message, let me begin with what you said about Martin Luther King and Coretta Scott King. The message was love is powerful. What kept them together was their love for each other. Of course, their love for the people and their love for the movement. But I think that scene that I spoke about, he sold the fact that even though he might have been not faithful, he loved her.
Right.
And she sold that she loved him. I mean, there was so much truth in that moment. Secondly, the second message I think the movie got across is that we are one. I mean, this really, I didn't have the feeling it was a movie of black against white. In fact, there was a moment in the movie where it said that Malcolm X was trying to raise white consciousness, I mean black consciousness, and Martin Luther King was trying to raise white consciousness. I think that's a mistake. I think that Martin Luther King was trying to raise human consciousness. And the third message I think that was important in this movie is that freedom is not free. It is going to take struggle. You can look at that movie and know if that battle had not been fought, it could have taken years for African Americans to get voting rights because it was entrenched so deeply in the system that a county clerk could stop a black person from voting by asking them ridiculous questions that even white people didn't know the answers to. Social significance, Mike. What do you think the significance?
Can I say something
Yes.
before you go to that?
Mhm.
Well, no, I'm gonna let Mike go, then I'll come back to that. Okay, go ahead, Mike.
The social significance right now,
Yeah, yes, of this movie.
in my opinion, it goes back to what's happening today. It's hard for me to say I can relate to what happened back then because obviously I wasn't there. I can only relate to what's going on today. So I think of Sanford, I think of New York, I think of Ferguson, I think of Oakland. You know, those are the things that I think of today, and it once again shows me that yes, things have gotten better, yes, things have changed, but some things have not changed. That so far, that's really what and it shows in a different light where Jamie Lee Jackson was killed. He's a young person who was an activist, and in the movie it shows him and his parent, his mom and his granddad being beaten, and all of a sudden the cop for some reason feels that he's had enough. He pulls out his gun and he shoots. It's three cops going up against one young man, his grandfather who's in his 80s, and his mother. And those three cops could not subdue those three people without killing one person first. And after they killed the young man, they just walked out. The social significance when I looked at that was Trayvon Martin, when you have a wannabe cop, and George Zimmerman doing the same thing, or you have the Eric Garner case, or John Crawford. You know, that right there, it just shows me, like, once again, I can't say this enough, where things have changed, but it hasn't changed as much. And I realize what you guys went through back then is something that we're going through now, not on the same level, but it's still there.
Well, one of the things, too, that is interesting about that whole incident is during 50 years ago, Southern Democrats were using obstructing African Americans from voting, using tough rules and tests. And today, Republicans across the country are using basically what was the Democratic strategy. So it's not a question really of Democrats and Republicans. It's the strategy that's the problem.
Are you saying Democrats who were what they call the Dixiecrats were doing that?
Right.
Make that distinction, please. And Malcolm X said he said there's no difference between a Dixiecrat and a Democrat.
Yes. But Jesse Jackson said there are both Pharaoh's chariots.
Mm-hmm.
What about you, the social significance, Lenny?
Well, I want to go back to start with something that we were talking about before, as it regards Martin Luther King and as it regards Malcolm X. To me, it's no accident that Martin Luther King was a Muslim minister who was very universal in the end in his approach. Martin Luther King was I guess he was a Baptist minister, but he was very ecumenical. Meaning,
you said Martin Luther King was a Muslim. You meant Malcolm X was a Muslim.
Malcolm X was a Muslim, and Martin Luther King was a Baptist.
Right.
Even going back to Mahatma Gandhi was a spiritual man. So the social significance to me that I hope our audience is getting is that underlying all these great movements uh, uh, is a spiritual force. Uh, and that leads to my second point about the social significance. Uh, and it just so happens that when you look at the word psychology, for instance, you see the word psych in there. If you go to the average school, they will tell you that psychology is a study of the mind and human behavior. But if you look at it, the etymology within a dictionary, you'll see that the word psych means the soul or the spirit. And this is a lot of what's missing in the movement today. The inability of some people to separate religion from spirituality. And therefore, we have what we call psychosocial or psychosocial pathology. And I think that the significance I get from this movie is that there needs to be maybe a slightly different approach in dealing with oppression in America, whereas we see it for what it is. It's a pathology, it's a sickness, it's a disease. And in all phases of life in America, uh, uh, like for instance, before we let people become police officers with the deadly weapons in their command, they need to be psychologically tested. But psychologically tested is not just a mental thing, it's a spiritual thing. How to do that, we can talk about later. Uh, and finally, I would say the social significance is that um, we need to all look in the mirror when we see how Dr. Martin Luther King and SNCC and all of our leaders suffered that oppression but persevered. We need to look at and see whether we are part of the problem or part of the solution. Are we subject to the same pathology of the oppressor, or are we going in a different direction? And I submit to you that you cannot take the divine, you cannot take the spirit out of anything. And we need to go beyond religion, conventional religion, and beyond conventional politics and ideology. And we need to bring to the fore our spiritual force in dealing with these kinds of problems.
To me, the social significance is twofold, and they're very old messages. One is people that do not know their history are doomed to repeat it. And the Selma March is something that we don't know. I've talked to a number of young people that are studying Black history in college, and they're not teaching it. In fact, Mike, you're a history major, aren't you?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And you went to a historically Black college. How much did they cover about Selma?
Probably, it's kind of like the whole Rosa Parks set, Malcolm was angry and Martin marched. That's basically the whole Selma thing. Oh, Black people got beat. You've already known that. Somebody got shot. That's typical. And Martin finally got to, was walking to where he finally got to go. He marched. That's basically that was it. They
So the
really didn't go into depth
of those 3 months didn't come across.
Say that again?
The pivotal nature of the Selma March 3-month campaign was not really stressed.
Until the movie, and I started doing my own personal research on it, I didn't know it was for 3 months. I didn't know there was 3 marches, or 3 attempts, I should say. All I know is a group of Black people got together. They were going to march. It had something to do with voting. A lot of Black people got beat.
All right.
That's basically all I know at the time.
I don't think that you're unique. I think most people don't know that. And I must say that the movie was educational for me as well. I didn't know about the Turnaround Tuesday and the why of it. And the other thing I think that's important, the social significance, is a Martin Luther King saying, "The truth crushed to the earth shall rise again." And I think this movie is making that possible, making that truth and that struggle possible that many people do not know about. Now, there's some controversy surrounding this film. One, I'm going to have each and one of you deal with them. There's controversy about A lot of Jews on the internet are saying that they didn't feel they were represented. A lot of actors in the movie, from George Wallace, family members of George Wallace Johnson, are saying they don't feel they were represented. I'll take that. And Mike, I'm going to ask you to talk about the fact that the director was not nominated for a Oscar. Lenny.
Well, one of our esteemed professors teaching up at City College in New York, Michelle Wallace, made me aware of an article by Stacy Patton. She's a black woman, a writer, and she dealt directly with this issue of the Jewish question. And quote unquote, she says, Selma was about more than voting rights. It was about our right to be recognized as fully human and understood for who we are. Not for everyone with their own agenda who keeps telling us who we're supposed to be, and demanding that black people be inclusive even while excluding us from nearly all aspects of American life. Demanding our voices be less prominent so that others get their due is a denial of humanity. So she goes on to say that what we need to realize is that it was really about a lack of representation of Jewish clergy or the lack of visibility of religious Jews. And she mentions the fact that there are some Jews who are actually segregationists. They weren't mentioned. And he also communistic, and they weren't mentioned. And also Sammy Davis Jr. was a Jew, a black man who wasn't mentioned. So I don't have a particular opinion on it, but I think you would it might be interesting for our listeners to Google Stacy Patton, and she wrote a wonderful article about the whole issue of the Jewish misrepresentation, which is really symbolic of what you were talking about. A lot of people feeling that they weren't accurately or fully represented.
And that leads me to the second point of everybody protesting their roles.
But can I just say
didn't have enough in them, or in the case of Governor Wallace's son, that he was totally mischaracterized. I think in a movie, the truth has to be compressed, and this movie is 2 hours and 8 minutes exactly. To tell an epic story in that time with the multiple characters is tough. You've got to give, and she did a great job. There were many more characters. This was an ensemble performance. Well done. I don't think Johnson was misrepresented. He was, in fact, in opposition to Martin Luther King moving too fast. And he did, in fact, and it made a good case for him. Johnson was pushing for the war on poverty. Let's fight the war on poverty. We'll get back to voting rights. That doesn't make him a bad person. That doesn't make him a racist. That makes him a politician who, when the time was right, said, we shall overcome. That is, so I think it makes him look well. I think she made Wallace look as good as you can make Wallace look. I think the sheriff in Clark, you couldn't make him look good. He ordered the brutal, savage beating and allowed, not only did the state troopers, he allowed the mob to beat the marchers, and which was made up primarily, by the way, of young people. When I say school-age people, elementary school kids, were if not a majority, were a plurality. So I don't think they are being fair in their criticism of the director in those instances. Now, of course, there's the question of the Oscars just came into being nominated at this time, and the picture was nominated for Best Picture, but the director was not nominated for Best Director, and no black woman has ever been nominated for Best Director at the Oscars. Mike, do you have any opinions on that?
I do, but let me just backtrack just for a brief moment. So what you were saying regarding the Jews and how they felt that they didn't have a prominent role in the movie, David Oyelowo was on Good Morning America not too long ago, and he was talking about how long it took for them to make the movie. And it took 7 years, he was saying. 7 years. If you wanted a more prominent role in the movie itself, you should have been there trying to get the movie made in the beginning, in my personal opinion.
Mm-hmm.
So, like, you can't just come in and say, "Oh, we weren't represented." Well, when the movie was when they were trying to tell the story, you weren't there. Now that the movie's made and it's getting all this publicity, you want to say something and say, "Well, why wasn't I included?" You can't. It doesn't work that way. I'm sorry. To what you were saying with LBJ regarding how people felt that he was misrepresented. I believe Martin Luther King said it best. You can send troops to Vietnam, but you can't send them to Selma. That right there tells me your personal intent. You can say you're not a racist all day. It's okay. Freedom of speech, you can say what you want, but your actions will always be louder.
Mike, you're echoing a little. You must have changed rooms or something.
No, still here. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I hear you perfectly.
Am I still echoing?
But your point, just stay on your point, Mike.
Okay, and then like I was going to say also, take like George Bush for example. He was able to take down Baghdad in 21 days. It only took 21 days to take down Baghdad, but he couldn't get troops in less than 7 days to New Orleans. You know, what you say has nothing to do with what you actually do. You know, so when people say LBJ was portrayed incorrectly, I disagree. As to black people back then, that's how he was seen. And I think the movie portrayed him the way he was seen back then based off of his actions back then. To go on to what you were saying regarding her not being nominated for Best Director, obviously that's a disappointment. She should have been at least nominated. They didn't have to say she won, but she should have been. She could have been the winner, but she should have been at least nominated for Best Director. It's one of the best movies that has come out in a long time. They portrayed the civil rights movement, and I think the only major film that had Martin Luther King in it. If you think it's 2014, well, it was 2014 when the movie first came out, and there hasn't been a movie about Dr. King at that level to date. So for her to do an outstanding job, for the performance to be as well as it was, and the storyline to be written and brought to the screen to brought to life as well as it was, she should have definitely at least been nominated, if not have, I would dare to say, won an Oscar for Best Director.
Did you have some ideas about SNCC too? I thought I heard you mention about the roles of SNCC and other activists.
I believe that, honestly, I think she did. I don't think she could have done a better job in portraying the people that she portrayed the way that she did, and also the groups. I think it was Lewis who said in the movie that we had 2 years here in Selma to make a difference, but we haven't. And the people have basically said when Martin Luther King came, the people wanted him to take the lead. We had our chance, the people have spoken, and the people want him. So in a sense, that's actually what happened. The people rallied around him. Even though he wasn't the movement, but he was still the face of a national movement at that time. And I think that she represented that well. I think she did exactly the way she was supposed to do. Sometimes we get all upset with what actually happened in history and how we're portrayed versus we get upset with how we're portrayed in history versus what actually happened. You know, the story is told the way it happened, not the way you would have wanted it to happen. And I think she did her job in doing the story the way it actually happened.
All right.
Okay, how do you rate the movie, Lenny? 5 stars.
I give 5.
And what about you, Mike?
I'm gonna have to go 4.5. Not quite 5 yet.
Mm-hmm. I have to give.
I do miss the action. I do miss the Roots effect, but yeah, I go 4.5.
I give it 5, and let me add one more fact that pushes me to 5. This was a low-budget movie that did not feel like a low-budget movie. This movie cost $20 million to make. Unbelievable in today's times. And yet, I didn't feel like I was watching a Lifetime for TV movie. That is the story was just so compelling. Any precautionary notes from any of you?
Well, I just want to say one thing just real quick. I want to give shout outs to Brad Pitt. He actually helped produce both 12 Years a Slave and this. I didn't know that he was a part of Selma. And I think that white people within the civil rights movement, I think that's the one thing I should say that I think could have had more light shown on it. I think that a lot of white people have done a lot for civil rights movements, but haven't received the credit for it, or the level of recognition that it should have received for it. So that's my last comment for tonight.
Well, I got 3 precautionary notes. Number one, I hope that our discussion helps people to see that we need to do research before we go to these movies and after we go, so we'll understand the real context of the movie and the facts that have come out about the movie. Number 2, I would say that I would urge all people, black and white, and Hispanic and whomever, to bring your children to the movie and help them to see it in context also. And the third thing is, if you have any conservative friends who are not bad people but who just are misinformed, treat them to the movie and then educate them about the real context of it.
Yeah, first of all, I agree with you on all of those points. Don't be surprised, however, if your conservative friends don't change their position. But I think it's important for you to take them so they understand the passion of your position, especially as the civil rights struggle continues. I think it's important, especially when I hear them saying, well, Sharpton is playing the race card. Well, and is an outside agitator. Well, these are the same things they said about Martin Luther King at the time. So, you know, the precautionary note is to bring them. The second precautionary note is this is a movie. Don't send your kids to the movie, this movie. Go with them. The movie is one thing. Your discussion you have with them is critical. And there's some levels of sophistication on this movie that an adult needs to be there to explain. So that would be my precautionary notes. Thank you for joining us. Thank you, Lynn. Thank you, Mike, for taking out this time to share your opinions. And good night to you guys.
Good night. Thank you.
Good night.
And to my audience, this has been The Plot Thickens, and where empowerment goes to the movies. Please join us next time. Peace out. Okay.
We're still live.
Okay, I'm trying to find the off button. 1 second. It says, please wait. Just waiting to close out, audience.
We should mention, too, that we're going to be doing a series of podcasts or broadcasts on a number of different subjects, not just review of movies, but subjects which are geared to helping us to become self-mastered and tap into the power within us and make us able to be better contributors to global citizenship, sustainability, freedom, and so forth.
Have you discussed what your next topic will be?
We're probably going to do all the nominated movies for the Oscars. The one I'm thinking about is Imitation Game next, because they're all message movies. But basically, we're going to focus on movies that deal with some aspect of the empowerment. Okay, are we out now?
No, maybe you should just close your browser, Cooch.
Okay, let me do that.